So my name is Nate Kidwell. I'm going to be discussing ngrx-entity as well as a little bit of ngrx. I don't know if you guys are all how many are familiar with ngrx, so I don't want to burden those of you who know it very well with in-depth discussion of it. So I'm just going to briefly touch on it using an example application that might show you some more twists and turns to play with it and then I'm going to go through ngrx-entity. ngrx-entity allows you to kind of manage collections within ngrx in a slightly more intelligent way and takes care of some of the heavy lifting. ngrx used to be kind of a Wild Westy pattern that took after Redux. It was very nice, but a lot of the patterns behind ngrx seem to have solidified a lot. And entity, they've incorporated into the fold as a new way to handle stuff. I'm going to demonstrate via a little drawing application for holiday cards. Typical, make a holiday card and send it to someone app. How ngrx-entity works a little bit, as well as some more ngrx details. And then I'll show you some resources at the end about how it all comes together. My only assumptions are really that you know Angular 2 and onwards. That you're comfortable if you see TypeScript or ES6, that you could follow an ngrx example when I talk you through the ngrx. You don't have to really know ngrx to start with. We'll discuss exactly what it is. Also, that you're not opposed to the idea of software architecture. JavaScript is sometimes very nice because it lets you do a very flexible kind of application and do something quick and dirty, and that's often great. Certain types of applications, such as a drawing application, a Photoshop clone, a PowerPoint clone, and so forth, become horror shows if you don't really architect them from the beginning and use design patterns and object-oriented programming. And there's ways to do it via just a functional paradigm, but solid architecture pays off for certain breeds of applications. And except I'm going to veer away from some of the ngrx patterns to a slight extent when it comes to naming things and importing things, just for simplicity's sake and making things a little bit easier for people to see what's going on with. So the motivating example is going to be a holiday card designer. Basically, you're going to be able to select. I could actually do a quick run through of it for you guys. I don't know if you guys have seen Stack Blitz. It got a lot of fame recently among the Angular community and a lot of other people in React. It's like CodePen and those other tools, but absolutely on steroids. It allows you to kind of use the Angular app, code it up, and experiment with it and so forth. And if you have a drawing application for something like this, it lets you basically code it up, see what you're doing. And what we're doing is basically building an app that lets you change the thickness of a stroke, change the color, and so forth, and monitor it. And also, I didn't really do drag and drop in there to keep it simple, but you have the ability, once you create something, to move it around, to modify layers and delete various objects and so forth. And this is all using ngrx and standard patterns to go through how you do that. This down here is pretty much the ugliest layers dialog that you could have. Nothing like Photoshop's, but allows you to see what you're doing within the app and inspect it. And once again, it's using ngrx to do things. There's a lot of code, but basically it's, in this one case, I'm taking the buttons and each of these buttons is basically firing a update event. I'm gonna step through a little bit of how this fills through the code. I'll go back to the slides, but yeah, the code. Not that it gets hairy, but there's going to be a lot of nooks and crannies. So that's basically the motivating example. The code there is online. If anyone does want it, at stackblitz.com/edit/entity example, and the resources page will be at the end. So basically, ngrx pattern, to run through quickly, has these state objects that represent your system, and they're immutable. The idea is that if you're going to change the state of your system, you're going to actually replace the state of it with a whole brand new state. That seems very burdensome, but there's a lot of tools to help you do that in an easy way. There's going to be what's called a reducer function that runs. It takes in your state, and it updates it, sends out a brand new state. One of the things that ngrx has that's special is it uses RxJS to kind of listen to the state. So it observes it, and as state gets updated, it immediately updates everything on the screen. Another thing, notice state gets sliced up. You're not really doing with a gigantic monolithic state, you're able to take pieces of it and play with it. And it's a nice marriage between functional programming and object-oriented programming, the way that it's done in these worlds. Idea is that they're immutable, and you could see just in the second line, if you're going to change tasks using a little bit of ES6 goodness, instead of changing one element within a tasks array, you're kind of destructuring and restructuring using those triple dots tasks, and you're adding a new task to the end of the array. And you're doing the same thing with objects. You're basically destructuring with the triple dots what's in, let's say, an old task, and you're adding a new field into it, such as completed in this case. And there's a lot of library support. There's, Lodash has some niceness. Immutable JS is good. But with ES6 getting a lot more commonplace, and with TypeScript filling in a lot of gaps, these things aren't needed as much. But you have tools like object freeze, object assign, clones. You can make sure your entire state is frozen within ngrx or redux. And you have these things called lenses, which let you kind of really get through and change in part of an object. That's from the functional programming world. And so quickly to show you, we'll have like the designer for a greeting card, and it's got a state. It is a state for the pen, which really has a color and a thickness, and has an image state, which is the source that the image kind of comes from. The state gets aggregated. So you have a gigantic state that has within it kind of mini states of the system. So if you have a drawing application like we have here, you have a pen state, you have for the background an image state, and you have for the individual lines that you draw a line state. And if you use like the DevTools plugin, which works for Redux, which is very similar to ngrx or ngrx, you can inspect your state in a very nice way. And one of the things to note, because states are mutable, they get replaced rather than changed, once again using that 3-dot syntax. It's part of the ES6 sugar. Now, one of the big things with this whole paradigm is that you have these actions that cause state changes. Rather than you digging into a state and manually within, let's say, a drop-down box changing the state of a task, you fire these actions off. And they're asynchronous. They're a lot like JavaScript events or the command pattern. And they'll leverage the actions type property. They all have, the only thing common among these actions is they have a type, which is a string, and that kind of separates every sort of action from every other. And you could have a payload that the action has, and that it used to be just type any, but now it could be more strongly typed, and you're encouraged to do that. So within a designer, if you want to change pen color, you would have a change pen color function that's implementing type action. Because it implements type action, it has to have a type field that's a string within it. And it signifies to the system that you're changing the pen color, and that payload is the new color for your drawing pen. And a lot of times you'll see this kind of semantic that you'll have within a file that has all these kind of related actions. It'll spit out, let's say, a type of pen actions that's unioning across all the actions for that kind of family of behaviors. And the idea is state gets returned from a pure reducer function. You'll see up top, just you have a state function. So you have a function that takes in a state in action, spits out a brand new state. If you're going to have side effects, there's another library that takes care of that. We won't really deal with that right now. And within most of these reducers, there's a switch statement that's commonplace that switches on the action type. And even if the state's not returned, even if the state doesn't get changed within the reducer, because the reducer is ignoring all these actions that are given to it for one reason or another, it's going to return the state as like the default part of a switch statement. That's usually what you'll see. And this is a very common pattern within functional programming, whether people have done like Erlang or even the realm of racket books about Lisp dealt with something very similar to these reducers that dealt with the game state of a world. So this comes from the functional programming world for the most part. There's reducers, or they're called folds sometimes, but they are very much beloved now within object-oriented programming. A very quick example of a reducer, you see here that comment switch statement. You see here, once again, it's taking in the actions type, which is that string. And depending on the actions type, it's changing the thickness or the color of a pen. And it's, in the cases where nothing's done, it returns just the state of the system as it is. And you'll notice, once again, it's rather than changing the state, it's returning a new state that's using that triple dot syntax to mean we're taking a state, taking all the properties of it, kind of recopying it into a new object, and whatever's following, in this case, setting the thickness to payload or setting the color to payload, gets overridden. Once again, that's some ES6 goodness. So the state gets observed usually. It gets listened to via, we're leveraging RxJS to do this. It's where ngrx, the state management library, actually gets that Rx within its name. You can listen to the, you can have a subscribe call that is getting in an object or an array or some information from the state and directly assigning it to a field within your component. But usually what you're going to have is you'll have a typed observable in this component that's using an async pipe when it's being displayed to the screen or when it's being passed into another component more likely. Because of patterns, usually you'll have a smart component on the outside that listens to all these events within the store. When something happens, some information changes, it passes that into a dumb component. We're not going to talk too much about that, but for the most part, a smart component, like you see here, has this, for example, the pen data with the pen state. It's retrieving the pen state, and it's using this select, which kind of maps over the state and retrieves the pen within it and assigns that to pen data. Pen data is an observable, so it's not directly assigning it. It's the observable is getting assigned to pen data, and you'll see there's that $, which is the semantic to let people know that this is an observable. So usually when it gets displayed, what you see in the bottom for the container's HTML, there'll be an async pipe. You'll usually see pen data $, pipe async. And what that'll get passed into is a dumb component. You're going to have these smart components, once again, that listen to the store and that deal with observables. And then you'll have dumb components, which basically just have inputs and outputs like you would get from Angular core. And there's a lot of benefits to this. There's that single responsibility principle that you have one part of the system knows about the reactive part, one part is a dumb component that deals with more or less rendering. So there's some efficiencies that you get from dealing with rendering within a component that basically assumes it's getting in data, showing the data. If it gets in brand new data, it's showing that data and so forth. And there's an efficiency that if you set the change detection strategy appropriately, it's listening. It's saying, if I'm getting new data, I'm going to redisplay everything. Or I'm basically going to redisplay based on this data. But if I'm not getting new data, I know you're doing the right things. I know you're being immutable. I know you're not changing underneath anything, the data. So it's not going to display anything. So it's a little bit more efficient for these dumb components. State gets sliced also, just so you know. You have all these reducers that come together with the pen state and everything else like that. So you want to sometimes, they get combined in these action reducer maps that map across, that are like a hash that references all the different, basically all the different reducers. So you get, they reference the state of the system basically, and it's a map that lets you kind of observe different parts of the state of the system, and you can slice across of it. And think of a racing game. Right? If you have a racing game where you're listening to part of the system to show, like on a speedometer, the speed you're going at, that individual component doesn't really care about what's happening on the third building on the right and so forth. It's just showing the speed of a race car. So you're going to most likely be able to kind of select down, it's called, to kind of get into the information that you need. And we'll show with entity how that's a little bit easier to do. So within an example app, if you're going to slice the state, once again, you'll use that store.select, where you get basically a store that's inputted into your constructors or injected into it that's got the state of the system, and you will, through one means or another, kind of map down into there. And you'll go from the state to, if you want the image and the source of the image, just bring that information out. There's cleaner ways to do that, but that's just to show you how you're observing a part of a store, basically. So what's the motivation for ngrx-entity, which is what we're talking about now? Well, there's an API for managing collections. Usually when you deal with collections, they have a lot of things in common. A lot of times, tasks, customers, whatever it is that you're collecting, they have IDs. They're listed somehow. You want to add to that list, take from that list, change an item within the list, and so forth. There's a lot of this commonality that ngrx-entity observes and respects and helps you kind of deal with. So because there's so many common cases, it helps to reduce a lot of this boilerplate with a lot of helper for CRUD actions. And I'll quickly show for a drawing application that has lines what those sort of CRUD applications would be. One more benefit is, as opposed to those kind of that select where you're getting down to the image state and then down to the source of the image state, and depending on how things are structured, maybe a few more levels deeper. There's a lot of selectors that NGRX gives you out of the box and that you can kind of mash up together to get a little bit deeper with a little bit more ease. So it's going to make one assumption, and this is not really too dirty of one, that you have an entity state where you're basically you have all your objects have IDs, and your objects are stored rather than just in a generic array. They're stored within something called a entity state. You can see here you have all the IDs of the objects stored within here, and then all your objects are stored within this dictionary hash, anonymous object, whatever you want to call it, called entities. So I guess it's not anonymous anymore. But they're all keyed with this ID of these objects. And that seems kind of redundant, right? You have the ID of all these objects, obviously within the objects themselves. It's also within this hash, so you could look them up. And it's, once again, within the array. There's some efficiencies from that, but you don't have to worry about that, because since there's enough helpers that let you manage the state of your collection within ngrx-entity, you never really, if you're adding an object, you're not really also physically adding its ID to this array and adding its ID to the hash in order to look it up. You don't deal with any of that drama. If you're going to copy it, let's say we want to draw on top of a drawing application, we have these lines that are interfaces. They have IDs just to behave according to what entity expects. I think there's a way to go about things if you don't have generic IDs, but that's within the docs. I don't know offhand. And all these lines have coordinates. And you could see down below, to extend the entity state, you're basically taking the line, you're extending what entity state is, you're filling in that generic type with line in this case. And if you have anything you want specific to your use case, for example, we want to select a particular line, you have in here selected line ID. And that's going to be set to the ID of whatever line is selected. In our case, whatever line you just created, or in the layers dialog, whatever line you just click on in there, or set to null, obviously, if you don't have any lines selected. And just to show you what entity gives you, you're going to have a regular kind of line created action that you're used to, like before. There's nothing special there. Within your drawing application, you're going to listen to DOM events most likely, behave according to that to generate the coordinates for your line. There'll be some tricks you have to do with that, and you'll create a new line. Once you create the new line, that's nothing that isn't generic ngrx. It gets this action for creating a new line gets passed into your reducer for the lines. Now, the first thing to say is that this reducer's helped, because you don't want to deal with the heavy lifting, once again, of managing the IDs for all your entities, and you want to have a lot of these use cases taken care of. You have these adapters, entity adapters. Up top, you just const adapter, entity adapter for line is using this created entity adapter function that you get from the ngrx-entity library. That's kind of boring, but once you have that, then within the actual reducer, if you see down below for create line, the very last line is adapter.add1. All you do is you pass in there the payload, which is the new line you're creating. You pass in there the state of your system, and it immediately updates your system with the brand new line. So once again, it takes care of all that ID management for you in those three places, which would otherwise be kind of a bug-prone enterprise. Just to show you a couple more of the actions that you get presented from ngrx-entity, you have delete line. Once again, that's just adapter.remove1, pretty simple. If you want to update a line, it's adapter.update1. And if you want to do your own thing, for example, to select a line, you're going to use the reducer your own sort of way, right? The way that we did before, where you're doing, you're just kind of, once again, destructuring and restructuring the state with that triple dot using that ES6 goodness. And in this case, you're passing in a brand new selected line ID. These actions are pretty much generic actions like you're using in vanilla ngrx. You're just passing in the information in the payload. The one thing to note that's kind of funky about entity, I'm not sure where I stand on it, is it uses the TypeScript partial type, which lets you actually kind of create an object, which lets you type an object to be the type of a different of a class, but kind of a subset of the properties within that class. And that's something actually within TypeScript. I think one of the Egghead videos steps through exactly how this works within TypeScript behind the scenes. But so the payload for update, it actually takes the ID and only the fields that are to be changed. It's not like you're passing up a whole object. It's kind of patching it, if you know that HTTP call. So the benefits to it, I'm mixed on it personally for personal reasons. Just so you could see here too, these adapters give you a lot of selectors. The way we were kind of manually selecting, where you do select the type of the, your state dot this substate dot this dot this. For adapters, for ngrx-entity, these adapters give you a little bit of goodness you could use. There's about 8 or 10 different ones, I think. I'm just showing you select all, which whatever your entities are, it gives you a selector that pulls out the entities as an array, which often is going to be how you'll use it. Or if you want to get the entities as that kind of entities object, you could do it that way as well. And this adapter.getSelectors call takes that adapter and creates selectors for it, and you just pass into that a feature selector. Feature selector is really what helps you kind of narrow down your state from the massive state of the system down to something such as the pen state or the to-dos state or whatever you're dealing with. And you can build on these selectors to add your own. This is just showing you very briefly how you would create a selector that always yields the object of the current selected ID. So rather than just getting the selected ID, it's always got the object that is selected. And there's a lot of reasons for ease of usage that that's what you want to be doing. You don't always have to use it, but this is how you would do that, and combining a few different selectors together. Just to see how you would do that, you would pass these selectors into your outside container smart component, and it would be store.select, select all lines, select current line, select line of pixel width 7, whatever this selector would be, and it would yield that information out. And it gets fed into the dumb components, once again, via this async pipe. You just have lines async, and this would list all those lines down below, like a really horrible version of the Photoshop layers dialog. And it would be a dumb component, so you could use it wherever you want to use it. And for layers, just to have the layer highlighted, I'm also passing in the selected line, once again, as an async on the lowest line here. So this is the next to last slide. I'm just going to show you, since the drawing's done with Angular SVG, they go together kind of nicely a lot of times. You can use SVG to take events, in this case mouse events, just like in Angular. You would have clicks and everything else like this, but now you can have an SVG DOM node that's listening to mouse downs, mouse moves, mouse ups, behaving appropriately with that behavior. And basically, it's rendering on top of that SVG object whatever sort of lines you have. And it's just doing a regular ng4 line of lines, and it's iterating new paths for each line that you've created. And one thing to note about SVG is because it's Angular doesn't recognize basically all the SVG parameters, because there's like 9 million of them. You'll have like adder.stroke you're setting as opposed to just .stroke, because that is that's receiving. Your code's not going to compile, basically, because it's not going to recognize them, and Angular is going to try to be safe, so it's going to let you know there's a problem. So you always want to do adder.stroke, adder.d, adder.stroke with. If you have a problem, at least you'll notice it. And these, once again, these are receiving the state of the system, the thickness of the line of the color, and they're changing the stroke accordingly. Last slide, just resources. ngrx has an official article. I think it's the only article on their Medium blog is introducing entity. There's official docs. I just put the bit.ly URLs because they're long. There's the official example app for ngrx, which uses, at least in the book reducer, they use entity. Our example, once again, is at stackblitz.com/edit/entity example. You could, I didn't put a license, it's a whatever you want with it license. And there's a really great course, ultimateangular.com, with ng story effects, which is an outstanding and absolutely free ngrx course. Very thorough, doesn't cover entity, but on my way in, I got an email from Todd Moto, the creator of the course. I mean, he, not personally, he emailed like 40,000 people, but that they're doing an add-on with ngrx-entity. So I don't know when that's coming, but it's worth it. I can't believe it's free. That's the best. It's one of the best courses I know of, especially considering it's free. And that's about it.
All right, I'll ask a quick question since I'm up here. How long did it take for you to actually get familiar with ngrx?
I'd use similar patterns, so it wasn't too horrible. If you're starting fresh, you probably would want to understand reducers and actions, and then build something out and start playing with it. There's a lot more examples these days than there used to be. Your user groups had a few good talks. Xavier, who preceded me, did a very good talk about 6 months ago or so. And before that, there was a good ngrx talk as well. So there's been a growing amount of documentation on it that I think has really, over the past month or two, skyrocketed. So I think it's easier now to get started because the framework for ngrx is really, it seems like it's come together. It's become more canonicalized, and the references about it have become much more rich than they were. So.
All right. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you.